Hello, and thank you for joining us once again on the Blazers Edge Weekend Podcast. I am your weekend co-host, Brandon Goldner. Your weekend podcast host, Chris Lucia, has the day off, but we have Blazers Edge staff writer Eric Griffith with us. Eric, what is happening, man?
Let me tell you, Brandon, if Chris is ever going to take a weekend off, this was the perfect one for him to take off. I love that I get to fill in on the same night the Blazers clinch a second-round playoff appearance for the second time in 3 years after over a decade of, I don't want to say playoff ineptitude, but playoff ineptitude.
Yeah, absolutely, man. It is a wonderful night to be a Blazer. As you know, I actually attended the game. I was sitting up in the cheap seats in the standing room only section, and we will get to that in a second. But Eric, first I wanted to kick it off with, so the Blazers, they won their first round series yet again against a depleted Clippers team. But I know that you caught this game. And before we go into looking into the second round matchup against the Golden State Warriors, who themselves are missing their best player and, presumptive two-time MVP Steph Curry, I wanted to ask you exactly what you thought of this Game 6. It didn't necessarily have the flow of what most Blazers fans were probably expecting. They were probably expecting a blowout, and we didn't get it tonight. But Eric, I wanted to ask you, what did you think of this game, and what do you think are the takeaways that Blazers fans should be looking for from this game as they may relate to the second round series against the Golden State Warriors?
So the big takeaway was, I think you're right, there was no continuity in this game, and it was an interesting and also at times infuriating game to watch because of that. The first quarter, the first half, the Blazers were all over the offensive glass. I think Mason Plumlee had 8 of his 14 rebounds within the first 12 minutes. Totally flipped the script in the second half, and all of a sudden DeAndre Jordan was grabbing every rebound in sight. For the first time all series, Mason Plumlee was failing to block him out. And that's what, really kept the Clippers in the game in that second half, was their rebounding. But at the same time, the Blazers turned around the three-point shooting seemingly out of nowhere, hit 7 consecutive threes in the third quarter, kept them in the game and gave them a small lead at times, and then looked like they more or less just gutted it out with some key plays from guys like C.J. McCollum down the stretch, and really out-executed the Clippers. The Clippers kept putting Paul Pierce on Damian Lillard, which, little old, no offense to Paul Pierce, but he's a little past his defensive prime.
Just a little bit. Yeah, and not to get too reductive on it, but just to go back to Mason Plumlee, I managed the Blazers Edge Twitter account, and I tweeted right after the game that the series MVP of any Blazers player had to be Mason Plumlee. I believe that he had double-digit rebounds in every game in this series except for Game 1. He tallied quite a few assists. If I'm not mistaken, Mason Plumlee was the Blazers' leading assist maker in this series. So, Chris, I just wanted to ask you, if you had to pick an MVP of this first-round series, and again, all of this is with the caveat that the Los Angeles Clippers were without the services of their best player in Chris Paul and in their second best player in Blake Griffin for about half of the series, or maybe a little bit more than half the series. But if you had to pick an MVP of this first round series for the Blazers, who would it be? For me, it would be Mason Plumlee. For you, would it also be Mason, or would it be someone else?
So first of all, you're talking to Eric and not Chris. Let's just make that clear for the listeners.
Did I call you Chris again?
You did.
I just want to make it clear to listeners that we already took one take and I had mistakenly called you Chris. I'm so used to working with Chris, and I've had such an incredible night that I may be a little bit tired at this point. We're recording at 11:32 Pacific time, and for Eric, it is 2:32 East Coast, so I apologize for that. Eric Griffith, who is your MVP?
You know what? It's worth it for the listeners, though. It's worth it because we're so excited about this Blazer victory.
I think all of us are, and I think that we have a little bit of room for forgiveness at this point.
Let me throw a couple stats out there for you about Mason Plumlee in this series. In, I believe it was Game 2, he tied Chris Paul with 9 assists and led the entire team, led both teams in rebounding with either 14 or 16. It was the first time in the playoffs and the third time all season that any player had beaten Chris Paul and DeAndre Jordan at rebounds and assists in the same game. So massive diversity in his skill set. And then the follow-up was he kept that going for games 2 through 6. And I think it was the Blazers, I'm not seeing the tweet right now, but I think it was the Blazers marketing department that tweeted out that he's the first Blazer since Maurice Lucas and Bill Walton in 1977 to have 10 or more rebounds in 5 consecutive games. With the inconsistency that Damian Lillard and CJ McCollum showed, I think you absolutely have to go with Mason Plumlee as the series MVP for round one.
For sure, man. And I'm glad to hear you say that because, I mean, like I just said, he's definitely my MVP for this first round series. And the other thing I wanted to touch on before I think we want to pretty quickly pivot to the Warriors series because it's coming up pretty quick. I mean, the first game, to the best of my understanding, will be at Is it at 12:30 on Sunday?
You're correct. You're correct. 12:30 Sunday on ABC. So the Blazers have about a little more than 36 hours turnaround time, and they need to be down in Oakland playing a game.
And now to be fair, my understanding is also that even if the Blazers had lost this game, that they had scheduled their next game on Sunday at 12:30. Regardless of whether it would have been against the Warriors or the Clippers, and they would have been going to California either way. So I guess in some respects the Blazers kind of knew where they stood no matter what. But I wanted to touch on one more point, which is that, again, like I attended this game. I was in the cheap seats up in the standing room only crowd. And I know that most of our listeners have probably been to a Blazers basketball game before, and they know that it's much different from watching it on TV. You can get much more emotionally invested in the game, and you can miss some stuff, right, during that game. If you're actually in attendance, that if you're watching from your house, I think that you can probably pick up on a little bit more of it. But just, I wanted to give my perspective, which is that this game was, I mean, there was so much talk about how in Game 5, the Blazers knew that they had an advantage because the Clippers were without Chris Paul and Blake Griffin, that they thought that the Clippers would maybe bring out a lineup or two that the Blazers hadn't seen, and in that way would maybe confuse the Blazers or maybe make them feel uncomfortable, make them feel like they didn't really exactly know how to attack the Clippers. And it was odd to me to see in this game that the Blazers came out flat yet again. I was super surprised being at home in Portland with a crowd who obviously cared very much, was very much invested in the outcome of this game. To see that the Blazers came out as flat as they did, and like you said a little bit ago, the Blazers hit the third quarter with I don't know how many threes in a row they hit. I know Mo Harkless went nuts in the beginning of that third quarter. And I just wanted to kick it back to you to say, is this something that we should be worried about? Like the fact that the Blazers knew, I mean, even in Game 5, right, that they were heading into what some people call a trap game, and they didn't really live up to expectations for most of that Game 5. They ended up pulling it out, but that they did it again in Game 6. Eric, does this concern you at all for this Warriors series that the Blazers just don't, they maybe don't have what it takes to actually get up to that emotional level to overcome a team that either, may be injured and kind of on their last legs and have nothing to lose, or a Warriors team that has, a very strong system, maybe without Steph Curry, but is going to be a very, very difficult pull at any rate. Are you at all concerned the Blazers are not going to be able to get that emotional temperature up to where they need it to in round 2?
No.
Why not? Well, because that's something that I'm worried about, frankly. I mean, I think a lot of fans are looking at these games and wondering why the Blazers didn't just stomp on the Clippers' throats. So why does that not concern you for round 2?
So we talked about this actually on the special edition of the Blazers Edge Weekend podcast exclusive to Facebook on Thursday night. So you can go back and check that out. It's archived there if you want to get kind of the pregame 6 with me, Chris, and Brandon. And one of the points that we really hit on in that podcast was a discussion about whether or not the Blazers have a tendency to play down to their competition once they're actually favored to win a game. Whether or not Damian Lillard in particular and the Blazers in general rely on that chip on their shoulder, underdog, us against the world, they mentality.
Hashtag they, right?
Sorry, hashtag they.
You got to throw that hashtag in there, Eric.
You're right. You're absolutely right. And you know what? When you take that hashtag away, we see things like tonight where they seem to maybe not be less motivated, but they have a harder time controlling the game when they're expected to win. And one of the few good things about facing the Warriors is that on no planet at any time, unless 3 more Warriors starters get hurt, will the Blazers be favored to win those games. And so Damian Lillard can do his full, no one expects us to win, they think I'm going to get trashed, and go down to Oakland and, give it his all. And hopefully we see some of his classic vintage Damian Lillard return home performances.
Now, here's the thing I have to say about that. So you look at a team like the Blazers, they were facing an undermanned Clippers team in Game 5 and Game 6. They did not necessarily, to use a kind of a tired cliche in sports, they did not step on the throats of their opponents when they were down, right? By contrast, you look at Game 5 between the Rockets and the Warriors, where the Warriors completely dominated the Rockets from the opening tip. I mean, they were up 37-20 in the first quarter, and that was pretty much all she wrote. You look at a Warriors team, even again without Steph Curry, in that Game 5, Klay Thompson went 10 for 14. Draymond Green had 15, 9, and 8. Brandon Rush, of all people, had 15 points off the bench. Sean Livingston, who's starting in place of Steph Curry, went 7 for 8. I mean, clearly this Warriors team is focused. They know what they're doing. They have a system. They know how to play it. And so I'm just wondering, is this second-round series, even without Steph Curry, is this a winnable second-round series for the Blazers? And if so, in your view, what is it that the Blazers are going to have to do? In games 1 and 2 are going to be on the road in Oakland, right? What do you think are the most important points that the Blazers are going to have to focus on in order to have a chance in this series?
That's a loaded question. I will say this. I think the Blazers have a chance to win at least one game. And one of the things that, for the Blazers, is good about the Warriors is that there's a huge amount of variance in a Warriors game. They'll run off 12 straight points. They'll give up 12. They'll run off 12 more. Over time, that works out in their favor. Versus a team like San Antonio that kind of nickel and dimes you to death. San Antonio just doesn't make a mistake all night. They turn the ball over less. They get every offensive rebound. They prevent your offensive rebounds. Over time, those preponderance of extra possessions adds up. Whereas the Warriors are playing fast and loose, and they're going to give you a chance to get back into a game if you also get hot, especially if you're the Blazers. The question is, can the Blazers out-Warrior the Warriors 4 times in 7 games without Steph Curry? Personally, I'm a little skeptical of that.
No, man, that makes sense. I mean, anyone would be skeptical, facing a 73-win team. Even if they're without their best player, they're still an incredible team. But I kind of wanted to parlay this into a question. We solicited some questions both on Twitter and on Facebook. And just to say that we always appreciate when you folks give us questions. Doesn't matter how. I know that we can't always get to them, but we very much appreciate it. And so just to give a shout out to all of you who are always contributing those questions, thank you so much. We got a question from Facebook from Marcus Ehrenberger. He asks, and Chris, I want to ask you this. Marcus says, I know it sounds crazy, but does a matchup against the Warriors actually play better with Portland's style? Going into this series, we thought the seeding was going to be advantageous, but we definitely underestimated the impact of the Clippers' defense and DeAndre Jordan's ability to dominate inside defensively. I don't see, and by I mean Marcus asking the question, I don't see the same disadvantage against the Golden State Warriors, and it might open up Portland offensively. So, Eric, I want to ask you, does a matchup against the Golden State Warriors play better with Portland's style than the matchup against the Los Angeles Clippers in your view?
So I think this is a really good question from Marcus because he's kind of getting at the overarching theme of what we're going to see in these 2 series. We just got done with a series where ostensibly the Clippers were led by a pass-first point guard in the mold of Isaiah Thomas, maybe Magic Johnson, who plays that classic role of getting his teammates involved. They had the 7-foot-whatever DeAndre Jordan with the go-go gadget arms standing back, blocking every shot in the lane against the Blazers. This team is a exact inverse of Portland, with Portland scoring, penetrating guards who are looking to shoot before they pass. Mason Plumlee standing out on the perimeter making passes. I don't think you'll ever see DeAndre Jordan, throwing backdoor cuts to Allen Crabbe. The Warriors, on the other hand, I think, play a very similar style to Portland, or maybe I should say Portland plays a very similar style to the Warriors. If you watch CJ McCollum, you can tell that he models his game after a number of players, and one of them is Steph Curry. He's taken moves like straight out of Steph Curry's playbook all year. A lot of the actions the Blazers run to get shooters open on the perimeter, nearly identical to the Warriors. It's clear that the Blazers think the style the Warriors play is effective and works with their personnel, and are going to do the same thing. So to circle back around and answer Marcus's question about whether or not a matchup against the Warriors is going to play better with Portland's style, certainly it's going to play differently. And that's why I think this is a great question, because it's absolutely true that now we're playing instead of the opposite. Now they're playing instead of the opposite of themselves. They're playing essentially a superior version of themselves. And for that reason, I think the Clippers matchup was actually a better one, because when you're playing someone who has a totally opposite style of you, you can theoretically take them out of their game. You can use your strengths to minimize their strengths. Whereas when you're playing the Warriors, their strengths are the same as yours. So if you play your normal game plan, you're going to be playing the same game plan against a team that's better at it. So you have to completely rework your system to have a chance.
So, Eric, I wanted to ask you, when the Blazers beat the Warriors this year, the Warriors were pretty much at full strength, right? The Blazers ended up winning that game by 30-plus points. It was totally insane, and actually, to the best of my recollection, I remember that I think it was me, you, and Chris who recorded a podcast before that Warriors game, and you and Chris had pretty much written it off as a loss, and I very jokingly said the Blazers were going to win by 20. They ended up winning that game by 30. Part of the reason why the Blazers won that game was because they ran, right? I mean, they ran, and they ran hard. The Blazers are one of the youngest teams in the league. They have, in my view, they have a ton of horses who can, go as fast as they can for, 30-plus minutes a game and not get worn out. I was actually pretty surprised that the Blazers didn't employ that strategy against the Clippers, considering the Clippers, especially without Chris Paul and Blake Griffin, if you have people like Pablo Prigioni, like Paul Pierce, like Jamal Crawford, who were all basically reanimated corpses. They're super old. I was surprised the Blazers didn't run more in that series against the Clippers, but against the Warriors, I could definitely see running being effective. So, I just wanted to kick it to you to ask, do you think that the Blazers are going to try to run more against the Warriors? Do you think that Terry Stotts is going to shake up his offensive schemes based on the matchup that they're facing against the Warriors? And if he does, do you think that running will be a part of that repertoire?
That's a difficult question to answer against the Warriors, because they do thrive on that chaos. But you're right that it's one of the Blazers' strengths, where if the Blazers can get out in the open court and, get Mo Harkless some fast break buckets, they can really get him going. Mason Plumlee can take advantage of literally the shock. You look and see other wings just like, oh, wait, the big tall guy is still dribbling the ball. Oh, shoot, it's too late to get in front of him. He's going to throw a layup or throw an alley-oop to Aminu in the corner. And so there's definitely some advantages to be had there. I think the big thing is with Damian Lillard, which Damian Lillard we're going to see, though. And I think more importantly than running, it's going to be getting the Blazers' star player going, because as Lillard goes, the Blazers have tended to go this season. And we saw him definitely have a very up-and-down series against the Clippers. So I'm going to kick it back to you, Brandon, and I'm just wondering if you think Damian Lillard is going to be able to get going against the Warriors more than he was against Chris Paul and the Clippers.
Yeah, I do think so. When you look at the Clippers, you look at Chris Paul is probably the best defending point guard in the league. Is that still true? I would say that it is. Steph Curry is obviously going to be out for at least a handful of games. You have Sean Livingston, who is a very lengthy defender at the point. I think that he's 6'7", and he's very long, but he's getting up there in years, not maybe necessarily as mobile as he used to be. People were talking about Sean Livingston when he first came in the league. They were talking about him as being another Penny Hardaway, right? Before he had that insanely gruesome injury where he tore every ligament in his knee. If anyone has seen this video of Sean Livingston when he was on the Clippers get injured, it's nothing that you'd want to see a second time. But even at his relatively advanced age compared to Damian Lillard, Sean Livingston is still relatively mobile. He's very long, but I do think that Damian Lillard will find some success against the Warriors. And to your point about Damian Lillard having up and down series, absolutely true. And it's interesting, this game 6 against the Clippers was a microcosm of that, right? Damian Lillard in the first quarter, I believe that he had 14 points in the first quarter. He only had 14 more points in the subsequent 3 quarters. He went 9 for 21, 28 points. and 9 for 21 is not particularly good shooting, but he did go 4 for 9 from deep. He did have 7 assists and 5 boards, so I do think that Damian Lillard will find some success against the Warriors, but I don't know if that's going to necessarily be the marquee matchup there in this series against the Warriors. Have so many different offensive weapons, and they're so good defensively. I mean, when you look at who the Warriors have coming off the bench, I mean, they have Andre Iguodala, who, granted, again, is a little bit long in the tooth, but he is quite big, quite long. He can defend several different positions. And you have Mo Spates, you have Varejao, you have Brandon Rush, you have Festus Ezeli. These aren't necessarily marquee players, but they know their role, and they know exactly how to fit into this Warriors system. So just to bring it back around, I do think that Damian Lillard will find some success in this series, but I don't know if that's going to necessarily be the determinant in this. And just to that point, I want to kick it back to another question that we got from Twitter. Maybe just a little bit more lighthearted of a question, just because we still do want to revel in the victory of this this Game 6 win over the Clippers. 20,000 Thorns at 20,000 Thorns asks, Mason Plumlee, great Trailblazers center or greatest Trailblazers center? Eric, what do you think?
Well, like I said earlier in this podcast, he is the first Blazers center since Bill Walton to have 10 or more rebounds in 5 consecutive playoff games.
So you're pretty much saying that Mason Plumlee is the second coming of Bill Walton. Did I get that right?
I don't think I want to go that far because I know we have a lot of Arvydas Sabonis fans in the Blazers Edge community. And I feel like if I offend the Arvydas Sabonis fans, I may have to go right for Clips Nation for the rest of my career. And I don't know if I want to do that.
Oh, Clips Nation has been unbelievably gracious. I know that you coordinated with Clips Nation as our sister blog on the SB Nation network of NBA blogs, and you did some work with them, and they've been incredibly gracious throughout this series. Just a shout out to them, and our hearts do go out to Clips Nation and to Clippers fans. Injuries suck. I mean, I've said this a couple times, but just to say, I mean, I don't want to go into this too far, but like, injuries suck, right? I mean, having your 2 best players go out, that's not very much fun. I mean, think about if Damian Lillard and CJ McCollum both went out in the same game. That wouldn't be good.
And I want to echo that and point out that the Clippers fans went through one of the most ridiculous 12-hour twist of fates that you will ever see in the history of the NBA.
Absolutely.
If you think about it, they were flying high. They're leading the Blazers. They get new word that Steph Curry's going to miss 2 weeks. All of a sudden, they're thinking we can finish off the Blazers quickly. Maybe we have a puncher's chance at beating the Warriors, and then we're going to play the Spurs, who we beat in the playoffs last year. So for 12 hours, they are riding high, thinking there's a chance we can make the finals, even though the Spurs and Warriors were unbelievable all year. We can salvage this season. They're as high as can be, and then within 12 hours, they've lost their 2 best players, and all of a sudden, they're wondering if this entire team is even going to be back next season. That is a torturous turn of events.
It absolutely is. And just to say that I spied with my little eye on Twitter that Bill Simmons, the great Bill Simmons, I don't know whether or not he was being sarcastic. It's really tough to tell sometimes with Bill Simmons, but he said that it was something along the lines of, clairvoyant Bill believes that Blake Griffin has played his last game as a Los Angeles Clipper. I don't know how much to make of that, but I do think it's true that the window on the Clippers core is closing. I mean, they did everything that they possibly could to retain DeAndre Jordan to the point that Blake Griffin and company, basically locked DeAndre Jordan, in a house so that he could not sign with the Dallas Mavericks after making a verbal commitment to them during this offseason. The 2015 offseason has made all the more entertaining for that drama. But yeah, I mean, I will say that for the Clippers, it's kind of a bummer. It's definitely a contrast to the Blazers, who have not yet found their stride, right? I mean, this Blazers team has not yet reached its potential. I wouldn't even say they've gotten close. This season was not supposed to be a season in which they made the playoffs. This season was certainly not supposed to be a season in which they made the second round. I mean, this is totally crazy. Granted, injuries had much to do with this. And as it tends to happen in history, that luck is when opportunity meets preparedness, right? And so the Blazers, while they were not expected to be a great team, they definitely played all season like they believed in one another, like they knew what they were doing, like they believed in Coach Stotts, they believed in Damian Lillard as their best player. And now here they are in the second round. So, Chris, I mean, even if the Blazers were to, let's say, worst case scenario in the second round, right? The Blazers fall to the Warriors 4 games flat, right? They get swept. I'm just curious, from a personal level, do you think that the Blazers' playoff success will have any impact, any effect whatsoever in free agency, in attracting free agents? I know my limited understanding of the salary cap and how everything works with that is that basically right now the salary cap is skyrocketing because of this new TV deal that the NBA has. A lot of teams have a lot of money, and so it's kind of difficult. You know, the Blazers have done well to retain a decent amount of cap space, but you know, a lot of teams have cap space. Do you think that the Blazers' playoff success is going to be any determining factor in attracting free agents at all? I mean, is that something that you're thinking about from where you're sitting right now?
To be honest, not really. We saw last year where Greg Monroe said, I'm going to go to Milwaukee because they're more playoff ready than Portland. That was one of the first times I can remember a player, you know, publicly saying that, unless it's going to like Miami to play with the big three. Unfortunately, that totally backfired on him, and we saw the Milwaukee Bucks completely fall apart this season and win 28 games or whatever they won. We've also seen in recent years the Phoenix Suns go from winning 49 games or 48 games, barely missing the playoffs, and then falling off the face of the earth. So I think, unfortunately, a trend we're going to start to see is that relative playoff readiness or a low level of playoff success like the Blazers are experiencing is not going to be enough to recruit free agents, and things like fit with the rest of the roster and fit with the city and fit with the head coach are still going to be the primary determinants. And so maybe it gave the Blazers a 2 or 3% edge, but I don't think it is going to necessarily swing anyone's final decision.
Okay, so we're talking about fit. Now, I want to make this clear. We're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. We're talking about, you know, the off season. There's plenty that we can talk about this Warrior series, but frankly, it's going to be difficult to kind of suss out any sort of storylines or themes until these two teams at least play one game together. So I don't think there's any harm in maybe looking ahead a little bit. So you're talking about fit. There have been some reports lately about a particular center who used to be one of the most dominant centers in the league, who used to be one of the best centers in the league, one of the defensive anchors of the league, a defensive player of the year, who has been a rebounding leader for many years consecutive, who maybe hasn't had the best run with his last couple teams. We're talking about Dwight Howard. All right. So we've had a couple of reports, or at least one, maybe it was one report that spun off into several reports about how the Portland Trailblazers may be a little bit higher on Dwight Howard's wish list than other teams. So I just want to say, when you're looking at this Blazers team and you're assuming that they're going to be keeping Damian Lillard for a long time, you're going to assume that they're all in on CJ McCollum. Of course, you know, both Damian Lillard and CJ McCollum are draft picks of Neil Olshey, and Neil Olshey seems to have an affinity for his players, as evidenced by giving Al-Farouq Aminu one of the first contracts in free agency in 2015. He's someone who Neil Olshey had drafted when Neil Olshey was with the Clippers, and, you know, brought Aminu back to the Blazers. Do you think that Dwight Howard would be a good fit with this Blazers team? I mean, and the way I want to phrase this to you is that
I'm going to cut you off there. I'm sorry, because I already have the answer. Before you can, you know, and there's no rephrasing. There's no rephrasing needed.
Even without all the qualifiers, I had so many qualifiers I wanted to give.
And that's why, when you need to have a laundry list of qualifiers, that is a hard no. Think about how many teams he's alienated. We go back to the Orlando Magic. There's that super awkward video of him, you know, more or less stabbing Stan Van Gundy in the back and then going and giving him a hug. He alienates everyone in Orlando. He then heads over to the Lakers. He refuses to run the pick and roll with Steve Nash. Think about that. He refused to run the pick and roll with Steve Nash.
Are you saying that Steve Nash is like a good pick and roll point guard or something?
I'm going to go out on a limb and say they would have averaged 2.5 points of possession by shooting, with dunks. Kobe Bryant, not the friendliest guy in the world, but when you piss off both Kobe Bryant and Steve Nash at the same time, that's a wide range of personalities that you are not fitting well with. And then you go to Houston, same thing, James Harden maybe doesn't fit with a lot of people, but you also tried to get Kevin McHale fired, who, by all accounts, is one of the nicest and most relaxed guys in the NBA, dating back to the 1980s with Larry Bird. He has a long history of not just burning bridges, but dropping nuclear bombs on them. And I can't imagine a guy like that's going to be helpful in Portland, especially at $20+ million a year. I would say throw $12 million a year or $10 million a year at Jan Mahinmi, save some of that money, and get a high-quality wing instead.
So along those same lines, and I appreciate your boiling hot take on that, I will lend you
get those oven mitts out.
I was gonna say I'll lend you my Brandon Goldner oven mitts for that. And frankly, that take is not particularly hot because I think that you'd find a lot of Blazers fans who'd agree with you on all of those points that you just made. But we did.
Do you agree?
Yeah. Here's the thing. And I don't mean to get all like Amin Al-Hassan. Here's the thing. If you get Dwight Howard to buy into your system, which is that he is not going to be the top player or even the top, one of the top two players, if you get him to agree to that, if you get him to agree to running the system that Terry Stotts has established, if you get him to agree to take a shorter contract, if you agree to get him to take less than the max, if you put all of those things together, then I would say it might be an okay fit. And now I fully understand when you say that if you put that many layers of qualifiers on a player that you should just turn the other way and run. I understand that, but Dwight Howard has a couple decent years left in him. He's not a max player. My hope is that Dwight Howard doesn't see himself as a maximum contract player because that's not what he is anymore. No team is going to give him a full maximum contract for 4 or 5 years. Nobody's going to do that. Even with as much money as it's floating around, I don't think anyone's going to do that. Do you?
Let me ask you a follow-up question before we get to the contract. I want to address your point that the Blazers are somehow going to reverse his personality, and he's going to go from someone who's going scorched earth on his past teams and all of a sudden fit really well with Damian Lillard and Terry Stotts. Isn't it the height of hubris to imagine that our guys are going to be able to turn around 10 years of basically NBA animosity with this player?
No. Here's why. So you had a center who played with Dwight Howard in Orlando and not, to be fair, not one of the best centers of all time or anything like that, but Adonal Foyle was a reasonably decent center. He played with Dwight Howard in Orlando. He was on John Canzano on the radio. I think it was today. Technically now it's 12:08 a.m. Saturday, so yesterday, Friday. And basically what Adonal Foyle said was that if you challenge Dwight Howard, if you give him a system within which to operate, that he will rise to that challenge. If you allow Dwight Howard to be childish, if you do not give him a system in which to operate, that he will act childish. So when you look at a team like the Los Angeles Lakers, such as they were when Dwight Howard joined them, what did you have exactly? You had Kobe Bryant, Pau Gasol, then you had like the husk of Steve Nash, and then you had Dwight Howard. Kobe Bryant, not necessarily, like you said, not necessarily the most relatable player, not necessarily the most player-oriented player. He, depending on who you believe, he may or may not have run Shaq out of town, or maybe Shaq ran himself out of town. That's up to debate.
Can I say both?
I mean, you can definitely say there's some blame on both sides of that. And you look at Houston. Let's take a look at Houston. Let's take a look at who Houston's best players. James Harden. Does anyone want to play with James Harden? Is anyone excited to play with James Harden? Like, when you look at Daryl Morey, who's the general manager of the Houston Rockets, do you see that Daryl Morey is going to make a pitch to anybody and say, hey, do you want to come play with James Harden? And anyone's going to be like super stoked about that? I'm not so sure. So here's the narrative in my head.
But Brandon, you're skipping one team. You're skipping the Orlando Magic, his very first team, where he played for, I think he played there 5 or 6 years. He played for Stan Van Gundy, who is a well-respected NBA coach, has literally turned around the Detroit Pistons after they were complete cellar dwellers. They made the playoffs. They are an extremely promising team. He, by all accounts, great coach. Maybe a little bit of a little bit like Popovich, where he maybe rides his players a little hard, but overall he has a great reputation. They built that team around him, and they made the NBA Finals, and he was an MVP candidate. I don't know how a young player could ever end up in a better circumstance than that. And he went out of his way to run as far away from Orlando as possible.
All right, I have a response to that, and here it is. And it was the same thing that O'Donnell Foyle. I mean, I don't mean this. Sometimes when I make arguments, they don't necessarily carry the same weight as it does from someone else. But it's true that I had some of the same thoughts that O'Donnell Foyle had, which was this. Dwight Howard was very young, right? He was one of the last players who came directly out of high school into the NBA before they instituted the one and done rule. So Dwight Howard came into the league as an 18, 19-year-old, very young. Orlando was his first team. And you're correct, they found an unbelievable amount of success there. And it's possible that when he was, I don't know how old he was at that point when he left for the Lakers, he was like 26, 27, something like that, that he thought he could do better. He went to the Lakers, didn't like the fit, went to the Rockets, didn't like the fit. What O'Donnell Foyle said on the radio today is that Dwight needs to understand that he is reaching a point in his career where, I mean, he averaged 13, 14, 15 rebounds a game for like a half dozen years, right? He was a Defensive Player of the Year candidate for a half dozen years. He made the finals, as you said. He could be one of the best centers of this generation were it not for the fact that he hasn't found a ton of postseason success. And so my point is this, that it's possible that he has reached a point in his career where he's getting a little bit self-reflective, right? He is understanding the limitations in his game. He's understanding the way that the NBA is changing. He's understanding that he's limited physically in a way that he didn't used to be. So all of this is very speculative, but I would say that I do think it's possible that Dwight Howard could find success with a team that had a little bit more structure, had maybe a little bit more likable best player than James Harden. And again, of all people in the NBA, who is your best player on the team? I mean, James Harden has to be at the bottom of the list of people that you'd want to play with. Maybe that's not true, but that's the way it feels.
DeMarcus Cousins, apparently.
Fair enough. And yeah, and good point. I mean, we've seen rumors of DeMarcus Cousins is possibly on the trading block. Again, the Kings are a hot mess. That's like another hour of talking. By the way, I want to apologize for our listeners. This has become a Dwight Howard show after the Blazers just clinch a second round series for the second time in 16 years. Come on. But, I do think it's possible Dwight Howard could find some success in a system that maybe where he could slide in a little bit better. And so, I do think it's possible for the right price. And this kind of parlays into a question that we had that I will get to in a moment. Before I get to that, I want to kick it back to you, Eric. You might have one more thought about this before we go into the next question.
Actually, I was going to segue into the next question as well. I was going to say I don't think we're going to reach an agreement on this one.
Fair enough.
And I wanted to throw a stat out at you that I didn't get a chance to bring up earlier, but I believe is a Blazers Edge exclusive because I've never seen it mentioned anywhere else on the NBA blogosphere. Before the All-Star break, when the Warriors were 48-4, so this is February 19th, 2/3 of the way through the season, their average speed on offense, 4.71 miles per hour. Number 1 in the NBA. Their average speed on defense. Let me hit the resort button. 3.69, last in the NBA. So they were the fastest team on offense and the slowest team on defense, and they had top 10 or like top 5 offensive and defensive ratings. To segue back to making a point about the Blazers and the Warriors series, since that's what we're excited about right now, the Warriors have that super long lineup Brandon mentioned before we went into the Dwight Howard discussion with Sean Livingston, Draymond Green, Harrison Barnes, all of these guys who are more or less interchangeable. And with Steph Curry out of the lineup, they're going to play a lot more with Sean Livingston and Andre Iguodala. All of a sudden, they can basically switch across all 5 positions. And one of the reasons why they move so little, their average speed is so low on defense, is because they're literally able to just point and say, you pick up my man, you pick up my man, you pick up my man. It's incredibly disruptive for offenses and makes it really difficult to really get anything going. And honestly, I'm at a little bit of a loss for how the Blazers can adjust to that, especially when Steph Curry's out and now we have freaking Sean Livingston in there shutting down Damian Lillard. And when you have Draymond Green, when they go small and you have Draymond Green all over Plumlee, because he's not going to be like DeAndre Jordan falling back. He's going to be using his length and lateral quickness to cut off point Plumlee. And so I don't know what the Blazers are going to do about that.
Here's the thing, and I know that you had mentioned that point about how, so just to give our listeners some context, Blazers Edge has a relatively active staff who we talk amongst each other internally about, this or that. And one of the things that came up was, this matchup, the Blazers against the Warriors, would Mason Plumlee be able to find the same success against a Draymond Green, for example, as he did against a DeAndre Jordan? And here's my response to that, is that Plumlee, he may not be, he's a relatively decent ball handler. I think that's something that Draymond Green can contain. But at the end of the day, Mason Plumlee is 7 feet tall, right? Draymond Green is only, 6'8"? Something like that. Mason Plumlee is still going to have some lines of sight over Draymond Green, regardless of how good of a defender Draymond is. He's going to have some lines of sight to make those passes because he is so massive. And so I'm not as convinced that Mason Plumlee's passing is going to be affected by a defender like Draymond Green. I think that Mason Plumlee's ability to put the ball on the floor is absolutely going to be affected by a defender like Draymond Green, who's incredibly mobile, incredibly disruptive, plays very hard. But as far as passes are concerned, I have to say that I think that Mason Plumlee's length is going to give him some minor amount of wiggle room there to be able to compensate for how versatile of a defender Draymond Green is. And Eric, I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
I think it'll be an interesting matchup. It's to me, I'm totally convinced in my own head that Green's lateral quickness and his better perimeter defensive ability than DeAndre Jordan and his length is going to eat Plumlee up, and especially without a jump shot to really put any pressure on, to really put any floor spacing pressure on. I just don't see how Plumlee's going to respond as well to a more aggressive perimeter defender like Draymond Green. But as you're pointing out, it's not like the CJ McCollum Klay Thompson matchup where we know it's going to be a mess from square one. So that one does have the potential to go either way. And I could see Stotts, Stotts is the master of off-ball movement, even without shooters, to create open space. And Plumlee's great at vacating the lane to allow that open space to basically appear. So that may not be as much of a blowout of a matchup as I'm imagining, but there's some other matchups out there like CJ McCollum and Klay Thompson that I just don't see going well.
No, that makes sense. And I want to pivot away from that for just a moment and just to kind of touch back on the questions that we received. We actually received a question from one of our staff members, from Tara, also known as Team Mom. And Eric, this is something that you had mentioned in our Facebook exclusive podcast with myself, Chris, and you. But Tara asks, did you ever doubt Team Mom's prediction that the Blazers would lose the first 2 and win the next 4? Did you have any doubt about that, Eric?
I don't have the numbers right in front of me right now. There's this website called whowins.com, which looks like an Excel sheet that's just like dumps all of every single scenario of all four major sports with any 7-game series possible. And I looked up NBA first round 7-game series where the home team jumps out to a 2-0 lead. I think it was 2 teams have ever come back from that out of like 60. So the odds are incredibly low.
And just to be clear, that one of those 2 teams then. Oh, you're talking about first round series.
Yeah, first round only.
Okay, I'll give it back to you just a second, just to say I jumped in because the Blazers, in their lone championship season, 1977, as we all know, they themselves came back from an 0-2 deficit against the Philadelphia 76ers in the finals to win.
So are you in some way implying that the Blazers' success in 1977 is in any way relevant to the currently comprised roster? Because I love when ABC does this and they're like, this is Portland's 7th playoff appearance in the last 20 years or whatever. Is that relevant to you, honestly?
Let me turn the question back on you, Eric. Have you ever heard of a little thing called the butterfly effect? How what happens in the past may affect the future? No, I'm just kidding. No, I don't think that it's particularly relevant, but I do think it's interesting. So,
well, Brandon, let me jump in and say we say this, and you kind of make a good point there, I think, because CJ McCollum earlier this year did wear like a 1980 vintage Blazers warm-up jacket, and so he knows the history of the team. And the Blazers, as we know, look everywhere for inspiration. So there is a small chance, I suppose, that these guys are aware of Bill Walton. Well, of course, there's a 100% chance they're aware of Bill Walton. There's a small chance they're using that 77 team for motivation through this playoff run. I would love to be backstage to ask Damian Lillard that. He may look at me like I'm crazy, but I think it'd be an interesting question.
I don't think that he would look at you like you're crazy, because this is something I brought up more than once. I'm probably going to bring it up more than one more time, is that Coach Stotts, in his first couple months on the job, right, he brought into his office a poster of Coach Jack Ramsey of that 77 team that won the championship, with a quote that said something to the effect of, the team that plays together with less talent is going to beat the team with more talent that does not play together. And in my mind, that does kind of epitomize this Blazers team, at least this year, which kind of begs the question, something, again, that we talked about in that exclusive Facebook podcast yesterday, which is the Blazers seem to have difficulty playing from ahead, right? They seem to find more motivation in being the underdog. They had a little bit of trouble with the Clippers in Games 5 and Game 6. Granted, they did what they needed to do. They got the win on the road in Game 5. They got the win tonight in Game 6. Was obviously quite a bit closer than a lot of Blazers fans would have liked it to be. But do you see the Blazers, when they face this Warriors team that does not have Steph Curry, do you think that it's fair to say the Blazers are still going to attempt to frame this as the Blazers themselves are still the underdog, and that will carry them forward in this series? Just to say, do you think the Blazers are going to continue leaning on that underdog status in order to find the motivation to overcome these matchups that they face?
Absolutely. You don't hashtag they every tweet for 12 months if you don't intend, or 6 months or however long, if you are then going to drop that theme immediately as soon as you face a major adversary. I think the key thing here is asking when the intangibles are no longer enough to overcome the sheer talent on the other side of the court. With the Clippers, Blazers may have tied the series up 2-2 before Paul went down, maybe down 3-1. Ultimately, and I know some people are going to take umbrage with this, ultimately it looked like the Clippers were probably going to pull that series out against the Warriors. So at that point, the talent versus intangibles maybe gets a little bit even. The intangibles were clearly giving the Blazers a boost. Once you get to the Warriors, though, it gets a little more questionable. And the extreme example to prove this point is if you look at the Philadelphia 76ers, they had a lot of really good intangibles. They had a great coach. They actually played basically Moneyball NBA style. They shot from where they're supposed to shoot from. The Cleveland Cavaliers were a almost historic level behind the scenes mess for a near 60 win team. They fired their coach midseason. they would crush the Sixers in a playoff series because of that talent gap, even though we're not sure if LeBron James and Kevin Love have ever said a nice word to each other. We're getting to that point with the Blazers. It's not that extreme, but going up against the Warriors, we're at the point where, honestly, I don't know if any amount of intangibles is going to be able to offset that skill level.
And so we're running up against our time limit at this point, so I'm just going to try to close it out with this. We're obviously, you and I as Blazers fans are basking in the glow of this Game 6 win. Blazers have won a first-round series for the second time in, I think, 16 years. Regardless of how it happened, regardless of whether or not the Clippers got injured, Blazers fans know very well their share of injury woes. I mean, we had a whole dynasty of Blazers success, and Brandon Roy and Greg Oden taken out from beneath all of us due to injury. So, while we reach out to the Clippers fans in solidarity and say that we're sorry that you had your best players get injured, we also do understand the impact of that. So the Blazers are going on to the second round. Eric, I wanted to ask you, realistically, given how the end of this Clippers series shook out, given that Steph Curry is probably going to be out for a minimum of 3 games or perhaps 4 games in this second round series against the Blazers, given that the Warriors do have home court advantage, do you think the Blazers are going to win this series? How do you see this second round series shaking out when all is said and done?
So here at Blazers Edge, we try not to make too definitive of predictions because, prognosticating often doesn't end well. But if you put a gun to my head and force me to answer a question like that, I would say that a best case scenario for the Blazers is a split in the first 4 games with no Steph Curry. That's a best case scenario. And then regardless of Steph Curry, I think they lose it in at most 6 games. I think the probably safest bet is a 5-game series. Like I said, there's a lot of variance in the Warriors play, and there's a lot of variance in the Blazers play. So Damian Lillard always raises his game to another level in Oakland. So I'm just imagining that everything's going to go right for the Blazers, and things are only going to go half right for the Warriors in 1 game. Blazers are going to steal it, and then lose in 5 games. 6 games as a best case scenario.
I just want to go on the record and say this. I believe that the Blazers will win Game 1 in Oakland. I think they're going to...
Wow.
Yeah. No.
Wow.
Yeah, that's right. I think they're going to approach this Game 1 a lot differently than they did this Clippers series. I think that there is a mystique and a sheen to this Warriors team, with or without Steph Curry, that the Blazers have internalized and respect. And I believe that they will approach the game as such. And for that reason, I think they're going to come out and steal Game 1. I see this series going 6 or 7 games. I had predicted the Blazers to win this series against the Clippers. I had no idea that the Clippers' best players were going to get injured, so I am not considering that to be any sort of mark on my skills to predict something. But in this series, I do think this game, I do think the series against the Warriors will go either 6 or 7 games. I'm not really ready to say who will win. I think the Blazers do have a fighting chance, but I think that's going to about wrap it up. We're at 12:30 Pacific time. Unless Eric, you have anything else you wanted to add here at the end of this podcast?
I got one more question for you. This is from another listener/reader of Blazers Edge. Here at Blazers Edge, we were huge fans of Tim Frazier, especially news editor David McKay. I think Timmy might have been his favorite player. And so CJ Mayo, that's a Twitter user, CJ Mayo, and his handle is @SadadParty. He had a question for us, and it was, does Tim Frazier ever not wear a V-neck? And so I'm going to throw it back to you, Brandon, and ask, have you ever seen Tim Frazier not wearing a V-neck?
I'll be perfectly honest with you, Eric. I have never paid attention to whether or not Tim Frazier wears a V-neck or not. So I can't answer that question. I will say this, that if Damian Lillard is the franchise player for the Blazers moving forward, I wouldn't be super ultra surprised if Tim Frazier made it back to this team. Right? I mean, the way the Blazers are constructed now, with CJ McCollum as the de facto backup point guard, I'm not sure that Tim Frazier fits well on this team. But if you're envisioning a future in which Damian Lillard is still the best player, and things change a little bit, I wouldn't be ultra surprised to see Tim Frazier make his way back. I mean, in my time in being a Blazers fan, there have not been very many relationships where I've seen as close as the one between Damian Lillard and Tim Frazier seem to really hit it off and seem to really be close. So while I can't speak to the V-neckiness of Tim Frazier, I can say that it's possible he'll make it back on the team. Not really answering the question, but that's how I'm going to approach it.
Great answer.
So I guess that's going to about wrap it up. We're getting tired. We're both tired. We had a crazy game. It's late. It's 12:30. So I just wanted to thank all of you for joining us, and I wanted to thank Blazers Edge staff writer Eric Griffith for joining the Blazers Edge Weekend podcast. Eric, thank you so much for taking the time. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Brandon. I appreciate being on the show as always. I'd just like to remind the readers that you can find my writing on Blazers Edge under my name, Eric Griffith. I publish a feature column every Thursday and then a periodic second or third column through the week, probably 3 with the long gap between games and game 2 and 3 coming up. And then you can also find me on Twitter, and my handle is @DeeringTornado.
Thank you, brother. And Jerry Stackhouse.